It's one of those nights, the kind where the rain just doesn't stop. When the clouds seem to press down so low, you almost feel like they're suffocating you. But what if, on a night like this, you stumble upon something that shouldn't be there at all? Something that would never have appeared on any map, no matter how carefully you examined it. A village that doesn't belong in this world. A village that's been forgotten by time itself. The camera shows a person driving alone down a dark, rain-slicked road. Their headlights pierce the darkness, revealing a seemingly deserted stretch of highway. The rain beats heavily against the windshield. The wipers swish back and forth, but it doesn't help much. The road is narrow, surrounded by thick trees that seem to close in on the car, as if watching it approach. It was late, too late. The kind of late where even the bravest of people would turn around and go back. But not you. You're just passing through, right? Just trying to get home. But something feels off tonight. You can feel it in your bones, the hair on the back of your neck prickling. Maybe it's the storm. Maybe it's the eerie silence of the empty road. Or maybe it's something else. Something that's not quite right. The camera zooms in on the headlights as they flicker again. A faint outline of a village starts to emerge in the distance, barely visible through the rain. As the car gets closer, the village seems strange, out of place, too quiet. You weren't expecting this. There wasn't supposed to be any village here. You check the map, nothing. Just miles of road and dense woods. But there it is, right in front of you. A village, looking as if it's been frozen in time. No cars, no lights, not a single soul in sight. Just old, weathered houses, their windows staring out like hollow eyes. Why does it feel like it's been waiting for you? The car slows down as the driver cautiously enters the village. The street is empty, lit only by the faint glow from their headlights. The camera pans over the run-down houses, their roofs sagging, windows cracked or boarded up. The rain pours relentlessly, adding to the village's eerie atmosphere. You roll down the window slightly, trying to hear something, anything, but all you can hear is the sound of the rain. And then, just as you're about to drive away, you hear it. A footstep, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead. But there's no one around. You stop, heart racing, trying to figure out where it's coming from. The wind howls. The footsteps stop. The camera focuses on the houses as the driver slowly drives through the village. A figure appears in one of the windows just for a moment. A pale, ghostly face staring out, unmoving. Did you see that? A face, pale, ghostly. Just for a second, but you swear it was real. You slam your foot on the gas pedal, speeding down the empty street, trying to get away. But the road is getting narrower. And then, another figure. This one in the street, standing perfectly still. A man, his back turned to you, drenched in the rain. He doesn't move, not even as you drive past. You can't shake the feeling that he's watching you, that he's always watching. The car suddenly jerks. The headlights flicker and go out. The driver is now plunged into total darkness. The sound of rain intensifies. The car comes to a stop. The lights go out. Just like that. You turn the ignition over and over, but nothing happens. The silence is deafening. It's like the whole village is holding its breath. Your heart pounds in your chest as you look around, trying to see through the darkness. But all you can hear is the rain. And then, laughter. A soft, eerie laugh echoing in the distance. It's not funny. It's not friendly. It's hollow. It's unsettling. The camera zooms in on the driver's face, showing their fear as they fumble for their phone. No signal. You try your phone. Nothing. No signal. The laughter grows louder. You don't know where it's coming from, but it feels like it's everywhere. And that's when you notice something on the ground in front of you. A trail of wet, muddy footprints leading away from your car toward the center of the village. The driver reluctantly opens the door of the car, stepping out into the rain. The camera follows them as they walk toward the footprints. The village seems even more eerie up close, its buildings like broken memories. They find themselves walking toward the church at the village center, its spire pointing toward the dark sky, like a finger accusing the heavens. You don't know why you're following the footprints. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's fear, but something is pulling you in. The church looms ahead. The door is slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. You hesitate, but only for a moment. Then you push the door open. The camera moves through the church, showing broken pews, a dust-covered altar, and strange symbols scrawled across the walls in what looks like blood. The camera cuts to a series of quick flashes, each one revealing glimpses of the village's horrific past. People in old-fashioned clothes walking through the streets, some of them with their faces obscured, others with hollow, empty eyes. The camera zooms in on an old newspaper clipping, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. The headline reads, "The Curse of Devil's Hollow." You start to piece it together. Devil's Hollow. A village that was abandoned years ago. Its people cursed by something far older than them. The laughter, the footsteps. They were never alive. They were never human. The village itself is alive. It feeds on fear. It feeds on the lost souls who wander into it, never to leave. And now, you're one of them. There's no way out. No escape. Not anymore. The camera cuts to the driver, now running through the streets of the village, looking over their shoulder in panic. Figures appear in the shadows, chasing them. The camera cuts back to the figures from earlier, more of them now. They're not just watching anymore. They're coming after the driver. You start running, heart pounding in your chest. The streets stretch out in front of you like a maze, but they all look the same. No matter which way you turn, you can't get away. The footsteps follow you. They're right behind you, breathing down your neck. And then, there they are, the villagers. Dead eyes, rotten faces, slowly closing in on you. No escape. The camera fades to black as the sounds of footsteps and eerie laughter continue. The last shot is of the driver's eyes wide open in terror as they are surrounded. And then, silence. The village has claimed another soul, another one to join its endless nightmare. But remember, if you ever find yourself lost on a rainy night, on a road that doesn't show up on any map, maybe, just maybe, you're not alone anymore. The camera cuts to a series of quick flashes, each one revealing glimpses of the village's horrific past. People in old-fashioned clothes walking through the streets, some of them with their faces obscured, others with hollow, empty eyes. The camera zooms in on an old newspaper clipping, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. The headline reads, "The Curse of Devil's Hollow." You start to piece it together. Devil's Hollow. A village that was abandoned years ago. Its people cursed by something far older than them. The laughter, the footsteps. They were never alive. They were never human. The village itself is alive. It feeds on fear. It feeds on the lost souls who wander into it, never to leave. And now, you're one of them. There's no way out. No escape. Not anymore. The camera cuts to the driver, now running through the streets of the village, looking over their shoulder in panic. Figures appear in the shadows, chasing them. The camera cuts back to the figures from earlier, more of them now. They're not just watching anymore. They're coming after the driver. You start running, heart pounding in your chest. The streets stretch out in front of you like a maze, but they all look the same. No matter which way you turn, you can't get away. The footsteps follow you. They're right behind you, breathing down your neck. And then, there they are, the villagers. Dead eyes, rotten faces, slowly closing in on you. No escape. The camera fades to black as the sounds of footsteps and eerie laughter continue. The last shot is of the driver's eyes wide open in terror as they are surrounded. And then, silence. The village has claimed another soul, another one to join its endless nightmare. But remember, if you ever find yourself lost on a rainy night, on a road that doesn't show up on any map, maybe, just maybe, you're not alone anymore. You're driving late at night when you take a wrong turn. A shortcut, you think, to get home quicker. The road is unfamiliar, winding through dense trees. You check your GPS, nothing. The screen is blank. Suddenly you hear something. A whisper. It's coming from the trees. But when you stop the car to listen, there's nothing there. And that's when you realize the whispers are coming from the forest, and they know your name. The camera shows a quiet, isolated road on a stormy night. The windshield wipers struggle to keep the heavy rain at bay. The driver, a young woman, looks frustrated as she glances at her GPS screen. It's blank. You've driven this road 100 times before, but tonight, something's wrong. Your GPS isn't working. No signal. The trees crowd closer, shadows swallowing your headlights. You think you know the way, but somehow the road keeps twisting, turning in unfamiliar ways. And then, you see it. A sign, faded and cracked. Birchwood Forest. You've never heard of it, but it's late. You're tired. Maybe it's just a shortcut. The car slows down as the woman enters the thick woods. The sound of wind howling through the trees fills the silence. Suddenly she hears a whisper. At first, it's too soft to understand. The trees sway, the rain tapping against your windows. But then, you hear it. A voice, faint, almost like a murmur. It sounds like it's coming from the woods. You freeze, your heart skips a beat. You roll down the window slightly, straining to hear. Come closer, it says, barely audible, like a breath on the wind. The camera pans outside the car window, showing the pitch black forest. You look, but there's nothing there. No one. Just the shadows of the trees, standing still like they're watching you. Your hands shake as you close the window and hit the gas. But the whisper, it keeps following you. The woman tries to turn around, but the road keeps leading her deeper into the forest. The whispers grow louder and more distinct, calling her name. You turn around, but the road is no longer the way you came. It's like the forest itself is rearranging itself, trapping you. The whispers are growing louder now, clearer. They're calling you by name. Your heart races. You've never been here before, but somehow they know you. The camera cuts to her panic-stricken face as she desperately tries to start the car, but it sputters and dies. The engine stops. Silence. The whispers are gone, but there's something else now. Something worse. The trees. They're moving, not with the wind. No, they're shifting, bending, like they're alive. And then, right in front of you, the woman screams as a figure tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes, steps out from behind a tree. It's not human. The engine stops. Silence. The whispers are gone. But there's something else now. Something worse. The trees. They're moving. Not with the wind. No, they're shifting, bending, like they're alive. And then, right in front of you, the woman screams as a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes, steps out from behind a tree. It's not human. The engine stops. Silence. The whispers are gone. But there's something else now. Something worse. The trees. They're moving. Not with the wind. No, they're shifting, bending like they're alive. And then, right in front of you, the woman screams as a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes, steps out from behind a tree. It's not human. The figure approaches slowly, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching with every step. The camera zooms in on its face, a twisted, grinning mask of a human. It's not just one thing. It's not just a man. It's a creature of the forest, ancient, hungry. It's been waiting for someone like you. And as it steps closer, you feel it, cold, sharp dread creeping down your spine. You can't move. The whispers, now screams, fill your ears. Run, they cry, but it's too late. The forest has claimed you. The woman stumbles back as the creature grabs her, its grip like ice. She pulls away, but it's no use. The camera zooms out to show the endless trees of birchwood forest, their branches twisting like claws, reaching for her. And then, it's gone. The car, the creature, everything. The whispers fade as if they were never there, but the forest remains. The place you thought you knew, now a prison for the lost souls who wander in. And you, now, just another voice, lost to the trees. On a foggy morning, you decide to take a walk around the lake near your house. But as you reach the water's edge, you see something. A figure standing in the mist, watching you. When you call out, it turns, revealing a face that's only half there, and then it disappears. The lake hides many secrets, but this one wants to be found. It was a peaceful morning, or so you thought. The fog was thick, rolling across the lake like a living thing, wrapping the world in a thick, suffocating blanket. You were alone, just trying to enjoy the calm, until you saw it. A figure, distant, standing still in the mist, watching you. You're driving late at night when you take a wrong turn. A shortcut, you think, to get home quicker. The road is unfamiliar, winding through dense trees. You check your GPS. Nothing. The screen is blank. Suddenly you hear something. A whisper. It's coming from the trees. But when you stop the car to listen, there's nothing there. And that's when you realize the whispers are coming from the forest, and they know your name. The camera shows a quiet, isolated road on a stormy night. The windshield wipers struggle to keep the heavy rain at bay. The driver, a young woman, looks frustrated as she glances at her GPS screen. It's blank. You've driven this road 100 times before, but tonight, something's wrong. Your GPS isn't working. No signal. The trees crowd closer, shadows swallowing your headlights. You think you know the way, but somehow the road keeps twisting, turning in unfamiliar ways. And then, you see it. A sign, faded and cracked. Birchwood Forest. You've never heard of it, but it's late. You're tired. Maybe it's just a shortcut. The car slows down as the woman enters the thick woods. The sound of wind howling through the trees fills the silence. Suddenly she hears a whisper. At first, it's too soft to understand. The trees sway, the rain tapping against your windows. But then, you hear it. A voice, faint, almost like a murmur. It sounds like it's coming from the woods. You freeze, your heart skips a beat. You roll down the window slightly, straining to hear. "Come closer," it says, barely audible, like a breath on the wind. The camera pans outside the car window, showing the pitch-black forest. You look, but there's nothing there, no one. Just the shadows of the trees, standing still like they're watching you. Your hands shake as you close the window and hit the gas. But the whisper, it keeps following you. The woman tries to turn around, but the road keeps leading her deeper into the forest. The whispers grow louder and more distinct, calling her name. You turn around, but the road is no longer the way you came. It's like the forest itself is rearranging itself, trapping you. The whispers are growing louder now, clearer. They're calling you by name. Your heart races. You've never been here before, but somehow they know you. The camera cuts to her panic-stricken face as she desperately tries to start the car, but it sputters and dies. The engine stops. Silence. The whispers are gone, but there's something else now. Something worse. The trees. They're moving, not with the wind. No, they're shifting, bending, like they're alive. And then, right in front of you, the woman screams as a figure tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes, steps out from behind a tree. It's not human. The engine stops. Silence. The whispers are gone. But there's something else now. Something worse. The trees. They're moving, not with the wind. No, they're shifting, bending, like they're alive. And then, right in front of you, the woman screams as a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes, steps out from behind a tree. It's not human. The engine stops. Silence. The whispers are gone. But there's something else now. Something worse. The trees. They're moving, not with the wind. No, they're shifting, bending like they're alive. And then, right in front of you, the woman screams as a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes, steps out from behind a tree. It's not human. The figure approaches slowly, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching with every step. The camera zooms in on its face, a twisted, grinning mask of a human. It's not just one thing. It's not just a man. It's a creature of the forest, ancient, hungry. It's been waiting for someone like you. And as it steps closer, you feel it, cold, sharp dread creeping down your spine. You can't move. The whispers, now screams, fill your ears. Run, they cry, but it's too late. The forest has claimed you. The woman stumbles back as the creature grabs her, its grip like ice. She pulls away, but it's no use. The camera zooms out to show the endless trees of birchwood forest, their branches twisting like claws, reaching for her. And then, it's gone. The car, the creature, everything. The whispers fade as if they were never there. But the forest remains. The place you thought you knew, now a prison for the lost souls who wander in. And you, now, just another voice, lost to the trees. On a foggy morning, you decide to take a walk around the lake near your house. But as you reach the water's edge, you see something. A figure standing in the mist, watching you. When you call out, it turns, revealing a face that's only half there, and then it disappears. The lake hides many secrets, but this one wants to be found. It was a peaceful morning, or so you thought. The fog was thick, rolling across the lake like a living thing, wrapping the world in a thick, suffocating blanket. You were alone, just trying to enjoy the calm, until you saw it. A figure, distant, standing still in the mist, watching you. The voices were getting louder, sharper. They seemed to come from everywhere. the walls, the floor, the air itself. And then you heard one voice that spoke clearly, directly in your ear. Get out. You spun around, your heart racing, but there was nothing there. No one. The whispers faded, but that feeling, the feeling of being watched, didn't go away. You stepped back, ready to leave, but then you saw it. A shadow, long and unnatural, moving across the wall, growing closer, crawling like something was waiting to emerge from the darkness. The camera zooms in on the shadow on the wall, which shifts unnaturally. Something was in the house with you, something that didn't belong. You backed away slowly, but the shadow kept getting closer, its edges blurring, merging with the darkness of the room. And then, you heard the door creak behind you. Someone was standing there. You couldn't take it anymore. You ran out of the house, back into the street. But the village wasn't as empty as it seemed. The faces you saw in the old photograph, those people, they weren't just ghosts. They were something worse. Hollowbrook wasn't just a forgotten village. It was a cursed place trapped in time. The villagers had made a pact, a dark pact to live forever, trapped in the village, feeding on the souls of those who wandered in. The camera zooms out, showing the village in its full, eerie, decaying form, as if it's alive, pulsing with an evil energy. The village had been forgotten for a reason. It's not just abandoned, it's cursed. And now, you're part of it. There's no escaping, no way out. The village wants you. The village always gets what it wants. You ran faster than you've ever run before, but the village was closing in on you. The streets seemed endless, but somehow you were always running in circles. And then, you saw them. Figures, in the distance, the villagers, their faces twisted with that same lifeless stare. They were coming for you. The driver reaches the end of the road, but the village is now surrounding them. The camera shows the figures closing in, reaching out with pale, bony hands. There's no way out, no escape from the village of Hollowbrook. And now, you're part of it, forever. The rain poured down in relentless sheets, turning the dirt paths of the forgotten village into rivers of black mud. As lightning split the sky, a lone figure stumbled through the storm, clutching a flickering lantern. Each step brought the figure closer to the heart of the village, a place where shadows seemed alive, and whispers of the long dead echoed through the hollow houses. They said no one who entered the village after midnight ever returned. But tonight, someone was desperate enough to defy the curse. The storm had been raging for hours, battering the countryside and driving anyone with a shred of sense indoors. But for Alan Reeves, there was no turning back. His sister, Emily, had vanished 3 days ago, and her last known location was the outskirts of Black Hollow Village, a place shrouded in dark legend. Alan had grown up hearing the tales. Black Hollow was once a thriving community, until one fateful night, every resident vanished without a trace. Some said it was a plague. Others whispered of a malevolent spirit, angered by the villagers' greed. Over the years, those brave or foolish enough to explore its ruins reported strange phenomena, ghostly apparitions, disembodied laughter, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Most never made it out, but Alan had no choice. Emily's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. He was certain she had been drawn to the village by the same curiosity that had led her to explore abandoned places all her life. Now, it was his turn to face the unknown. As Alan approached the edge of the village, the rain seemed to intensify, drumming against his hood and soaking him the bone. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the landscape. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the eerie silence. "Emily," he called, his voice swallowed by the rain. Only the distant roll of thunder answered him. The lantern in his hand flickered as he crossed the threshold into Black Hollow. The ruins loomed ahead, skeletal remains of houses leaning at odd angles, their windows like hollow eyes staring into the void. The muddy path twisted through the village, leading to the central square, where an ancient well stood, its crumbling stones slick with moss. Alan's heart pounded as he scanned the area. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, and the whisper of voices teased his ears. He tightened his grip on the lantern, forcing himself to move forward. "Emily," he shouted again, his voice cracking. This time, he thought he heard something. A faint cry carried on the wind. It came from the direction of the well. Alan hesitated, staring at the dark mouth of the well. It seemed to draw him in, the shadows within pulsating with a life of their own. He peered over the edge, holding the lantern high. The dim light barely penetrated the darkness, revealing a slick stone shaft that descended into nothingness. Then he heard it again, a soft, desperate cry. It was unmistakably Emily. "I'm coming," he shouted, his voice trembling. There was no rope, no way to climb down, but Alan noticed a rusted ladder bolted to the inside of the well. Without hesitation, he hooked the lantern to his belt and began his descent. Each rung was slippery with rain and decay, and the air grew colder the deeper he went. The cries grew louder, mingling with an unsettling sound, a wet, squelching noise, like something moving in the darkness. At the bottom of the well, Alan found himself in a cavern. The walls glistened with moisture, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The lantern's light revealed strange markings etched into the stone, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked at them too long. "Emily," he called again, his voice echoing. This time, the response was clear. "Alan, help me." The sound came from a narrow passage ahead. Alan moved cautiously, the squelching noise growing louder with each step. As he turned a corner, the passage opened into a massive chamber. In the center stood Emily, her pale face streaked with tears. Chains bound her to a stone altar, and her eyes widened in terror as she saw him. "Alan, don't come closer," she screamed. "It's a trap." Before Alan could react, the shadows in the chamber coalesced into a towering figure. It had no discernible features, just a shifting mass of darkness with glowing red eyes that bore into his soul. The temperature plummeted, and Alan felt an overwhelming wave of despair wash over him. "You dare trespass in my domain," the entity's voice rumbled, a guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alan's knees buckled, but he forced himself to stand. "Let her go," he shouted, though his voice wavered. The entity laughed, a sound like crackling fire and breaking bones. She came of her own will, drawn by the whispers of the lost. Now she belongs to me. Alan's mind raced. He had no weapon, no plan, but he couldn't leave Emily to this fate. Desperation fueled his next words. "Take me instead. Let her go, and I'll stay in her place." The entity paused, its eyes narrowing. A noble offer, but the price for her freedom is not so simple. You must give me something of equal value. Your soul. Alan hesitated, his heart pounding. He glanced at Emily, who shook her head frantically. "Don't do it, Alan. It's not worth it." But Alan couldn't bear the thought of losing her. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. You have my word. Take my soul and let her go. The entity's laughter echoed again, and it extended a shadowy hand. So be it. As the entity's touch enveloped him, Alan felt a searing pain unlike anything he had ever known. His vision blurred, and the chamber dissolved into darkness. When Alan awoke, he was lying in the mud outside the village. The storm had passed, and the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. Emily was beside him, unconscious but breathing. He shook her gently, and her eyes fluttered open. "Alan, is it really you?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. But as he held her, he felt an emptiness inside, a void where his soul had been. The entity's voice echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of the price he had paid. "You are mine now." Alan helped Emily to her feet, and together they left Black Hollow. But he knew the village's curse had claimed him. From that day on, he would be forever bound to the shadows, haunted by the whispers of the lost, and the knowledge that one day the entity would come to collect its due. The rain fell in sheets, drowning the earth in an endless, oppressive rhythm. Lightning carved the sky into jagged scars, illuminating the twisted remnants of the village below. A place forgotten by time, cloaked in shadows, and whispered about in the trembling voices of those who dared remember. No one who entered Grey Hollow after nightfall ever returned. Until now. The clock struck midnight as the worn-out bus halted at the edge of Grey Hollow. A single passenger remained. Elena, a young journalist with a penchant for chasing the macabre. She tightened her raincoat against the biting chill and stepped off, her boots squelching in the sodden ground. The bus's engine groaned as it pulled away, leaving her alone beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak. The villagers had warned her, their faces pale and their voices hushed. Grey Hollow isn't a place for strangers, especially after dark, they'd said. But Elena dismissed their warnings as superstition, fuel for the story she hoped to uncover. She had come to investigate the disappearance of 5 hikers who had vanished in the woods surrounding the village 6 months ago. A narrow path, overgrown and slick with mud, led into the heart of the village. The storm raged around her, but she pressed on, her flashlight flickering against the suffocating darkness. The air felt heavy, laden with the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she approached the first row of dilapidated houses, her light caught a sign hanging by a single rusted chain. Grey Hollow, established 1823. The letters were barely legible, the wood rotting away like the village itself. Elena's boots clicked against cobblestones slick with rain as she wandered deeper into the settlement. The houses were decrepit, their windows broken and walls leaning as if they might collapse under their own weight. A door creaked somewhere, carried on the wind, and she turned sharply, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the rain. No answer came. She found herself at the village square. A weathered fountain stood at its center, its dry basin filled with rainwater and decaying leaves. Around it, the shadows of abandoned buildings loomed, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. Elena shivered, not from the cold, but from the growing sense of unease coiling in her gut. Then she saw it, a faint glow coming from the largest structure at the far end of the square. It was the old chapel, its steeple leaning precariously. The windows glowed faintly, a warm amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Elena's curiosity overcame her fear. She had to know who or what was inside. The chapel door groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the light flickered, coming from dozens of candles arranged haphazardly across the altar. The air was thick with the scent of wax and damp wood, but it was the figure standing at the altar that made her blood run cold. It was a woman, her back turned, wearing a tattered white dress. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands, and her shoulders shook as if she were sobbing. Elena froze, unsure whether to speak or retreat. Before she could decide, the woman turned. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and void of life. She raised a hand, pointing a skeletal finger at Elena, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. The candles extinguished in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. Elena bolted. Her flashlight danced wildly as she fled the chapel, nearly tripping over the uneven stones. The rain seemed louder now, pounding against the rooftops like a drum beat. She didn't stop until she was back in the square, gasping for breath. But the village had changed. The once empty windows were now filled with faces, pale, featureless faces that stared at her with unblinking eyes. The doors creaked open in unison, and figures began to emerge, shambling toward her. Heart pounding, Elena turned and ran down a side street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear them following, their footsteps splashing through puddles. The village seemed to twist and shift around her, the streets forming a labyrinth that led her deeper into its heart. She stumbled upon an old mill at the edge of the village. Its water wheel, though broken, groaned as if turning under some unseen force. Desperate for shelter, she slipped inside and barred the door. The interior was dark and filled with the stench of mildew and rot. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for her pursuers. Silence, but it didn't last. A soft scratching sound came from the far corner of the room. Elena swung her flashlight toward it. The beam caught movement. A hunched figure crawling on all fours, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden, but the sound of its labored breathing filled the room. It lunged. Elena screamed and scrambled backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp. She ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind her. At the top, she found herself in a room filled with old machinery, its rusted cogs and chains hanging like grotesque ornaments. There was nowhere to go. The creature appeared in the doorway, its twisted form silhouetted against the flickering light of her flashlight. Its head tilted unnaturally as it stared at her, a guttural sound rumbling from its throat. And then it stopped. The growl turned to a whisper, words she couldn't understand, spoken in a language that felt older than the village itself. The machinery around her began to creak and groan, as if stirred to life by the creature's voice. Elena backed into a corner, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. Her mind raced for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in, the very fabric of the building warping under the weight of the whispers. The rain came down in relentless sheets, the kind that blurred the world into a cold, gray haze. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bell chimed, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to echo through the air without a source. Beyond the crooked trees, the outline of a forgotten village loomed, shrouded in mist and secrets. The village had a name, whispered only in fear, Ashenmore. Those who dared step foot in it after dark were said to vanish, their cries swallowed by the storm. But tonight, someone had come. Someone who didn't believe in the tales, yet would soon wish they had. The bus door creaked open, driver's face pale and hesitant. as he looked at the lone passenger still seated. "This is where you're getting off?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Ashenmore," she said firmly. Her name was Clara, a photographer with a taste for the eerie. She was chasing the story of her career, a piece on abandoned villages and their ghostly reputations. Ashenmore, a place steeped in legend and tragedy, was the crown jewel of her journey. "Don't stay long," the driver muttered, crossing himself before shutting the door and driving away. Clara was left standing at the edge of a forest path, her umbrella doing little to shield her from the downpour. The air was thick with moisture, and the faint scent of smoke lingered, a detail that made her pause. Smoke in a village abandoned for decades. She shook off the thought and started down the path. Arrival at Ashenmore. The path twisted and turned, the muddy ground sucking at her boots as the trees above twisted into skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours, the forest parted, revealing the village. Ashenmore was a place that time had forgotten. The houses leaned at odd angles, their roofs sagging under the weight of moss and decay. Broken windows stared like empty eye sockets, and the cobblestone streets glistened slick with rain. A church steeple jutted into the sky, its weathered cross tilting precariously. Clara raised her camera, the click of the shutter cutting through the sound of the storm. She moved slowly through the village square, her flashlight beam dancing over boarded-up doors and crumbling stone walls. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the air itself was watching her. Her first stop was the church. The heavy wooden door groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. Pews stood in neat rows, though many were broken or rotted through. At the altar, a single candle flickered, its light casting strange shadows on the stone walls. Clara frowned. The candle was freshly lit. She raised her camera again, focusing on the eerie glow. Just as she snapped the shot, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Clara whirled around, heart racing. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The church was empty. The whispering wall Clara hurried out of the church, her unease growing. She glanced at her watch. Midnight. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the village felt more alive now, as if it had been waiting for her. She thought of the stories she'd read, of villagers who had vanished after a mining accident poisoned the water. Some claimed the villagers' restless spirits now roamed the streets, seeking vengeance or escape. She dismissed the tales as folklore, but couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread clawing at her chest. As she moved deeper into Ashenmore, she heard it, the faintest whisper, like wind through cracks in stone. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stopped, shining her flashlight in every direction. The beam caught movement in a nearby alley, a flicker of white fabric darting out of sight. "Hey!" Clara shouted, running after it. Her boots splashed through puddles, the whispering growing louder with every step. She turned the corner and found herself in front of a house, its door slightly ajar. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity won. The interior was dark and damp, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. Furniture lay scattered and broken, as though abandoned in haste. A staircase creaked ominously, leading to the second floor. Clara's flashlight caught a photo frame lying face down on a table. She picked it up, wiping away the grime. The image inside made her blood run cold. It was of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. all staring straight at the camera. Their eyes were unnervingly blank, their smiles too wide. Scrawled across the glass in dark, dried streaks were the words, "Get out." A loud thud came from upstairs. Clara dropped the frame and backed toward the door, but before she could reach it, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Heavy footsteps began descending the stairs, slow and deliberate. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding as a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man in a miner's helmet, his face obscured by a thick layer of soot. He held an old lantern that flickered weakly, but his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "Who are you?" Clara stammered, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. The man didn't answer. He raised a bony hand and pointed at her. Then, in a voice like grinding stone, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The light in his lantern flared, and the room was consumed in blinding brightness. When Clara came to, she was lying in the middle of the village square. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder than ever. Around her, the buildings seemed closer, their windows filled with pale, ghostly faces, watching her every move. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices all saying the same thing. "Leave." She scrambled to her feet, clutching her camera. Her only thought was escape, but as she ran toward the forest path, she saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces blank and featureless. They moved in unison, their steps eerily silent. Clara's breaths came in shallow gasps as she sprinted toward the trees. The path seemed endless, stretching farther with every step. The whispers turned to screams, piercing and relentless, drilling into her skull. And then she saw it, a pale figure standing in the middle of the path. It was the woman from the photograph, her smile unnaturally wide, her blank eyes boring into Clara's soul. "Stay with us," the woman whispered, her voice layered with 1,000 others. "Join us." Clara screamed and turned to run, but the villagers were closing in from all sides. Their hands reached out cold and claw-like, pulling her into their suffocating embrace. Days later, the bus driver stopped at the edge of Ashenmore to pick up a new passenger, a man with a map and a camera slung over his shoulder. "Are you sure you want to go there?" the driver asked, his voice heavy with warning. The man nodded. "I heard it's a gold mine for ghost stories." The driver sighed and opened the door. As the bus pulled away, the storm began anew, and in the distance, the bell of Ashenmore rang out, welcoming its next guest. The rain was unrelenting, a steady torrent that drowned the land in cold, murky water. Thunder growled like an ancient beast, and lightning illuminated the twisted skeletons of trees lining a forgotten road. In the distance stood a village, its silhouette jagged and unnatural, as though the buildings themselves recoiled from the world. Locals called it Black Hollow, and its name carried a warning. "Never enter on a rainy night," they said. But some warnings are ignored. Emma tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The rain hammered against the windshield, her wipers fighting a losing battle to clear the glass. She squinted at the map on the passenger seat, its edges damp from the condensation inside the car. "Lost," she muttered under her breath, the word a bitter curse. She'd been driving for hours, trying to navigate the back roads of rural England, on her way to photograph an old estate for a magazine feature. The storm had come out of nowhere, swallowing the world in darkness and isolation. Her phone had no signal, and the gas gauge was dangerously low. A sign appeared in the beam of her headlights, weathered and leaning at an angle. Emma frowned. The name tugged at her memory, a whisper of an urban legend she'd heard long ago. Something about disappearances and ghost stories. But right now the promise of shelter outweighed her unease. With a resigned sigh, she turned down the narrow road. The village appeared like a ghost out of the rain. The houses were small and ancient, their stone walls slick with moss and age. Smoke curled faintly from a few chimneys, though no lights shone in the windows. The cobblestone streets gleamed wet under her headlights, and the air seemed heavier here, pressing against her chest. She parked the car in what looked like the village square. A large fountain sat at its center, dry and cracked. Its once proud sculpture eroded into an unrecognizable form. Emma grabbed her coat and camera bag, stepping into the storm. "Hello," Emma called, her voice swallowed by the rain. She knocked on the nearest door, the sound echoing unnaturally. No answer. She tried another house, then another, but the village was silent, its stillness unnerving. At last, she saw a faint glow through the rain, a light flickering in a window at the far end of the square. Hope sparked in her chest, and she hurried toward it, her boots splashing through puddles. The building was an inn, its sign swinging on rusty chains. The name, the Hollow Hearth, was barely legible. Emma pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like a whale. Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. A man stood behind the counter, his back to her. He was tall and thin, his gray hair hanging in unkempt strands over his shoulders. He turned slowly as she entered, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken but sharp. "Stranded in the storm, are you?" His voice was deep, almost melodic, but there was an edge to it that made Emma uneasy. "Yes," she said, shaking water from her coat. "My car's almost out of gas, and I need a place to stay." The man nodded, gesturing toward the stairs at the far end of the room. "Rooms are upstairs. Take whichever one you like." Emma hesitated. "Do you have other guests?" The man's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Not tonight." Emma chose a room at the end of the hall, its window overlooking the square. The bed was old but clean, the wooden floor creaking under her weight. She set her camera back on the nightstand and tried to call for help, but her phone still had no signal. Lightning lit up the sky, and for a brief moment, she saw the square clearly. Figures stood around the fountain, motionless and silent, their faces hidden in the shadows. Her breath caught, she blinked, and they were gone. Emma told herself it was just her imagination, the trick of the storm and exhaustion. But as the hours stretched on, the unease grew. The inn was too quiet, the storm too loud. And then came the sound, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the other side of the wall. She pressed her ear to the surface, holding her breath. The scratching continued, deliberate and rhythmic. It stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. "Leave." Emma didn't sleep. At dawn, the storm had lessened to a drizzle, and she decided to explore the village in daylight. With her camera slung over her shoulder, she stepped into the gray morning, the cobblestones slick under her boots. The village was eerily empty, the streets devoid of any signs of life. She passed houses with boarded-up windows, their doors hanging open. Inside, furniture sat untouched, as though the occupants had left in a hurry. She found an old church at the edge of the village, its steeple leaning precariously. Inside, the air was cold, and the stone walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the surface. At the altar lay an old book, its pages brittle and stained. Emma hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was jagged, the words written in an archaic style. It told the story of Black Hollow, a village cursed by its own greed. Centuries ago, the villagers had struck a deal with a mysterious stranger who promised prosperity in exchange for loyalty. But when the stranger returned to collect his due, the villagers betrayed him, killing him in the very square Emma had stood in the night before. The book ended with a chilling line. The storm is his vengeance, and the hollow, his tomb. He comes for those who enter on nights of rain. As Emma left the church, the rain began to pour again, heavier than before. The village seemed darker, the air heavier. She hurried back to the square, but her path twisted, leading her down unfamiliar streets. The houses loomed closer, their windows filled with pale, expressionless faces. Her footsteps echoed louder, joined by others, soft, shuffling steps that seemed to follow her. She turned a corner and froze. The figures from the night before stood before her, their faces blank slates, their hands outstretched. Emma ran, her heart pounding, the sound of the footsteps growing louder behind her. She turned toward the inn, its door still ajar. The pale man stood in the doorway, his face twisted into an inhuman grin. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The figures closed in, their blank faces filling her vision. Emma woke in her car, the storm reduced to a light drizzle. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard, and the gas gauge was no longer empty. She looked around, heart racing. Black Hollow was gone. The square, the houses, the church. Nothing but an empty field remained. Her camera bag sat beside her. She opened it with trembling hands and froze. The photos were there. Images of the village, the inn, and the pale man. But the last photo made her blood run cold. It was of her, standing in the square, surrounded by blank-faced figures, her own face twisted into a scream. Years later, travelers still speak of Black Hollow. They say the village appears only on stormy nights, luring the lost and desperate. Those who enter are never the same, and in the faintest echo of thunder, you might hear their whispers. Leave. The rain fell in a relentless curtain, drumming on the earth with an almost deafening rhythm. Somewhere in the dark, a clock struck midnight, the sound echoing through the empty hills. A distant scream pierced the night, sharp, brief, and chilling. The village of Ravenswood, hidden deep within the forest, was known for one thing. No one who entered it on a rainy night ever returned. But tonight, 3 strangers, lost and desperate, would test that legend. The storm was unrelenting. Water cascaded off the car's windshield, the wipers barely making a dent in the downpour. Jack clenched the steering wheel, squinting through the blur. In the back seat, his younger sister Mia fidgeted with her phone. No signal, she muttered for the 3rd time, shoving it into her pocket. Beside Jack, Sarah, his best friend, scanned the soaked map in her hands. "We should have hit the main road an hour ago," she said, her voice strained with frustration. "I think we're lost." "No kidding," Jack snapped, the stress of the journey gnawing at his nerves. The headlights illuminated a sign at the edge of the road, its paint peeling and the letters barely visible. Jack slowed the car, leaning forward to read it. "That's not on the map," Sarah said, frowning. "Do we have a choice? Jack replied, glancing at the fuel gauge. The needle hovered just above empty. Reluctantly, they turned down the narrow, tree-lined road leading to Ravenswood. The road was barely more than a dirt path, the rain turning it into a river of mud. Branches scraped against the car like skeletal fingers, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Then, as if emerging from nowhere, the village came into view. Ravenswood looked ancient, its cobblestone streets glistening under the rain. The houses were dark and decrepit, their windows like black, empty eyes. A single lantern flickered in the village square, casting long, dancing shadows. Jack parked the car near the square, the engine sputtering before falling silent. "This place gives me the creeps," Mia said, hugging her jacket tighter. "It's just a village," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Let's find someone who can help." They approached the lantern, its glow illuminating a stone fountain at the center of the square. The sculpture at its heart was worn and featureless, its purpose long forgotten. Around the base, jagged symbols were etched into the stone. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered. The group froze, straining to listen. At first, it seemed like the rain was playing tricks on them, but then they heard it clearly. A faint whisper, like a dozen voices murmuring in unison. A door creaked open behind them, the sound startling them. They turned to see a figure standing in the doorway of a nearby building. The hunched man, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide hat, motioned them forward. "You'll catch your deaths out there," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Come inside." The three exchanged uneasy glances, but followed him. The building was an inn, its interior dimly lit by a few candles. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew. "You travelers?" the man asked, shuffling behind the counter. "We're lost," Jack explained. "Our car's out of gas, and we need a place to stay for the night." The man nodded slowly. "Ravenswood isn't a place for visitors," he said cryptically. "But you're here now. Rooms are upstairs. Take what you need." "Wait," Mia interjected. "Do you know where we can get gas?" The man's expression darkened. "Not tonight," he said firmly. "Stay inside, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't open your windows." The rooms were small and sparse, the beds old, but surprisingly clean. The storm raged outside, the sound of the rain almost deafening against the roof. Jack and Sarah shared a room, while Mia took the one next door. As the night deepened, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to seep through the walls, rising and falling, like a sinister chant. Jack sat up, his heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" he asked Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It's coming from outside." He crossed the room and pulled back the curtain. The village square was empty, but the fountain seemed to glow faintly, the strange symbols on its base pulsing with an otherworldly light. Suddenly a figure darted across the square, pale, hunched, and unnervingly fast. Jack stumbled back, pulling the curtain shut. Morning came, but the storm refused to let up. The innkeeper was gone, and the village seemed emptier than before. Driven by unease, the group decided to explore, hoping to find someone who could help them leave. In the church at the edge of the village, they discovered a book, its pages yellowed and brittle. The writing detailed the history of Ravenswood, a once thriving village cursed by a betrayal long forgotten. Centuries ago, the villagers had made a pact with a mysterious figure who promised prosperity in exchange for loyalty. But when he returned to claim his payment, they turned on him, murdering him in cold blood. With his dying breath, He cursed the village, vowing that no one who entered during the storm would ever escape. The whispers grew louder as Jack read the final lines aloud. The rain binds you here. The dead walk among you. The curse is eternal. As they left the church, the villagers appeared, pale and silent, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of pain. The figures surrounded them, blocking every path. "We have to get back to the inn," Jack shouted, grabbing Mia's hand. They ran, dodging the grasping hands of the villagers. Their blank eyes followed them, filled with a terrible emptiness. Back inside, the innkeeper was waiting. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice barely audible. "The storm won't let you leave." "Why not?" Mia demanded. "What do you mean?" "You're part of it now," the innkeeper replied, his form beginning to fade like smoke. "The curse needs blood, and it always gets what it wants." Desperate, the group decided to make a run for the car. The villagers closed in, their whispers now a deafening roar. The rain seemed to thicken, slowing their movements and blurring their vision. Jack fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life just as one of the figures reached the car. Its hand slammed against the window, leaving a smear of black, oily blood. "Go, go, go," Sarah screamed, and Jack floored the accelerator. The car sped down the road, the trees closing in behind them like a living wall. The whispers followed them, fading only as they crossed the village's boundary. They reached the main road, the storm finally easing, shaken but alive. They swore never to speak of Ravenswood again. But the village wasn't done with them. Weeks later, Jack found a symbol etched into his car, a jagged mark identical to the ones on the fountain. And every time it rained, the whispers returned, no matter where they were, because Ravenswood never lets go. The storm came suddenly, swallowing the countryside in darkness. Rain hammered down in sheets, drowning the earth and turning roads into rivers. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 12, its chime swallowed by the roar of the rain. Then came the voice, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Help me, please." That was the first warning, but no one escapes the curse of Hollow Haven once it begins. The car's headlights struggled against the storm, illuminating little more than the rain-soaked road ahead. Jenna gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Beside her, her best friend, Mark, peered uselessly at his phone. The signal was gone. "This is ridiculous," Mark muttered. "How are we this lost? The GPS said we were 20 minutes from the cabin." "That was before the storm," Jenna shot back, frustration edging her voice. "We'll figure it out. Just look for signs." In the back seat, Leah, Jenna's younger sister, sat hunched in silence, her face pale. She hated storms, especially ones this fierce. "Guys, do you see that?" Leah suddenly said, pointing through the rain-smeared windshield. A wooden sign appeared on the side of the road, its paint faded and peeling. Jenna slowed the car as they passed it, the words barely legible in the dim light. "Hollow Haven, 3 miles. Mark frowned. "Hollow Haven, that's not on the map." "It's our best bet," Jenna replied. "We can't stay out here. We'll ask for directions or shelter until the storm passes." Reluctantly, they turned onto the narrow road leading to Hollow Haven. The road twisted and turned, the trees on either side pressing closer, as if trying to swallow them whole. The rain didn't let up. It only grew heavier, making it feel like the world was shrinking around them. Then, out of the darkness, the village appeared. Hollow Haven was small and eerily still. The houses were old, their stone walls covered in moss, and their windows dark. Cobblestone streets glistened with rainwater, and in the center of the village stood a fountain, its surface cracked and overgrown with weeds. Jenna parked the car near the square, turning off the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening. "Are we sure about this?" Leah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged. "We don't have a choice." The three stepped out into the rain, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the wet cobblestones. The village felt abandoned, but there was a strange weight in the air, a sense that they were being watched. A faint light flickered in one of the buildings, a small inn with a weathered sign that read, "The Weeping Willow." Desperate for shelter, they pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the air was warmer but thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic. A single candle burned on the counter, and behind it stood an old man, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes, though sunken, were sharp and piercing. "Travelers," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Caught in the storm, I see." Jenna nodded. "We're lost. Do you know how to get back to the main road?" The man shook his head slowly. "Not tonight. The roads here, they change in the rain." Mark frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you'll need to stay," the man said. He gestured toward the stairs. "Rooms upstairs, lock your doors, and avoid the windows." Leah shivered. "Why?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, disappearing into the shadows. The rooms were small but clean, their simplicity a strange comfort. Jenna and Leah shared one, while Mark took the room across the hall. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a living thing. Jenna sat by the window, peering out into the square. The fountain glowed faintly in the rain, its surface shimmering in a way that didn't seem natural. Then she saw them, figures moving through the rain. They were pale and indistinct, their forms almost translucent. "Leah," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "Come here." Leah joined her at the window, her eyes widening in horror. The figures moved closer to the inn, their heads turning toward the window, as if they could see the sisters watching. One of them raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and claw-like. Jenna yanked the curtain shut, her heart racing. "Don't look," she said. "Just don't look." Morning came, but the storm showed no sign of stopping. The innkeeper was nowhere to be found, and the village remained silent and still. Desperate for answers, the trio decided to explore. They found the church at the edge of the village, its doors hanging ajar. Inside, the air was cold, and the walls were covered in strange, jagged symbols. At the altar lay an old book, its pages brittle with age. Mark opened it, his hands trembling. The text was written in a strange, archaic language, but the illustrations told the story clearly. Hollow Haven had once been a thriving village, until its people had made a deal with something dark. A being known only as the Collector had offered them wealth and prosperity in exchange for their loyalty. But when it returned to claim its price, a life from each family, the villagers betrayed it, binding it to the fountain with a blood ritual. The final page was a warning. When the storm comes, the Collector awakens. No outsider shall leave. As they left the church, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The villagers appeared again, their pale forms now fully visible. Their eyes were black voids, and their mouths moved in silent chants. The trio ran, the whispers growing deafening. The villagers didn't follow, but simply watched, their heads turning unnaturally as the group fled back to the inn. Inside, the air was colder than before. The candle on the counter had gone out, and the walls seemed to close in. Then came the sound, a scraping like claws on wood coming from the door. Mark grabbed a chair, jamming it under the doorknob. "We're not opening that," he said firmly. But the whispers seeped through the walls, their words now clear. "Join us, join us, join us." Desperate to escape, Jenna remembered the car. "We have to try," she said. "We can't stay here." They made a break for it, the rain blinding and unrelenting. The villagers were everywhere now, their forms shifting and multiplying. The fountain glowed brighter, and from its depths rose something horrific. A figure taller than any man, its body twisted and blackened, its eyes burning with hatred. The collector. It reached for them, its claws slicing through the rain. The trio barely made it to the car, the engine sputtering to life as the collector's roar echoed through the village. The road out was no longer the same. It twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the storm. But Jenna refused to stop, her hands gripping the wheel as the whispers followed them. Finally, the rain began to ease, the road smoothing out. The village disappeared behind them, swallowed by the storm. Weeks later, Jenna found a symbol etched into her car's hood, the same jagged mark from the church. And every time it rained, she swore she could hear the whispers again, faint but undeniable. "Join us, join us. Hollow Haven never lets go." The rain poured relentlessly, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered the earth. It had been raining for hours, but it felt like days. The road was barely visible through the windshield, and every few seconds, a distant rumble of thunder shook the air. Somewhere out there, hidden in the unyielding darkness, lay a village whispered about in hushed tones, a place no one dared to visit. Tonight, 4 strangers would stumble upon its cursed gates, and by the time the rain stopped, none of them would ever be the same again. The car's wipers struggled against the downpour as Emma squinted at the road ahead. She was tired, lost, and increasingly uneasy. Her boyfriend, Chris, sat beside her, his face illuminated by the dim glow of his phone screen. In the back seat, their friends, Lily and Josh, huddled together, trying to keep warm. "We should have reached the cabin by now," Emma muttered, gripping the wheel. Chris glanced up. "There's no signal. I can't even check the map." "We're in the middle of nowhere," Lily said, her voice tinged with panic. "What if we don't find a place to stay?" Josh leaned forward. "Look, there's a sign." Emma slowed the car as they passed an old wooden sign, barely visible through the rain. "Welcome to Black Hollow. Population." "That's weird," Chris said, frowning. "Population question marks." Emma shrugged. "We don't have much of a choice. Let's check it out." The road twisted and turned, leading them into an eerie, fog-laden forest. The rain seemed to grow heavier, drowning out even their voices. Finally, the village came into view. Black Hollow was a shadow of a place. Dark, crumbling houses lined narrow cobblestone streets. No lights burned in the windows, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. The only sound was the rain, drumming against the rooftops like an unholy symphony. They parked the car in the center of the village and stepped out, the cold rain soaking them instantly. A flickering light caught their attention, a single lantern hanging outside a weathered building. "An inn," Josh said, relief evident in his voice. The sign above the door read, "The Hollow Rest." Inside, the inn was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. An old man sat behind the counter, his face gaunt and shadowed. He looked up as they entered, his eyes gleaming unnaturally in the candlelight. "Travelers," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here." "We're lost," Emma explained, shivering. "Our car's almost out of gas, and we need a place to stay." The innkeeper nodded slowly. "Rooms upstairs. You'll find them. Comfortable enough." "Thank you," Chris said, though the man's stare made his skin crawl. As they climbed the creaking staircase, the innkeeper's voice followed them. "Stay inside, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't open the windows." The rooms were simple, but clean, each furnished with a bed, a chair, and a small table. The storm continued to rage outside, the sound of the rain almost deafening. Lily pressed her face against the window in her room, staring out at the empty village square. "It's too quiet," she whispered. Josh joined her. "It's just a storm. Villages like this probably shut down when it rains." In the next room, Emma lay awake, unable to shake the unease creeping through her. Chris was snoring softly beside her, but she couldn't sleep. She got up and peeked through the curtains. The fountain in the square caught her eye. It was cracked and overgrown with moss, yet something about it seemed wrong. The rain pooled around its base, glowing faintly in the dim light. Then she saw them. Figures. Pale, thin figures, barely visible in the rain. They moved toward the fountain, their heads tilting unnaturally as if listening to something. Emma's breath hitched, and she stumbled back from the window. Next morning, the rain continued unabated. The innkeeper was nowhere to be found, but a note was left on the counter. "Leave before nightfall, if you can." "What does that mean?" Josh asked, his voice shaking. Chris frowned. "I don't like this. We should go." As they stepped outside, the villagers appeared. Silent, motionless figures stood in the square, their faces hidden beneath the tattered hoods. "What the hell?" Lily whispered, clutching Josh's arm. The group hurried past them, making their way to the church at the edge of the village. Inside, they found a dusty journal lying on the altar. Its pages were filled with jagged, frantic writing. It spoke of a curse, a deal made centuries ago between the villagers and a being called the Harbinger. In exchange for prosperity, the villagers promised to offer a life every year. But when they broke their promise, the Harbinger returned, binding the village in eternal rain and trapping the souls of its inhabitants. As Emma read the final words aloud, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, they grew louder and more insistent. "Do you hear that?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. The group froze, listening. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, echoing in the empty church. Then, the door slammed shut. A shadow moved in the corner, impossibly tall and thin, its eyes glowing red. "The Harbinger," Josh breathed, his voice barely audible. The shadow lunged and they scattered, running back into the rain-soaked streets. The villagers were gone, but the fountain now pulsed with a sickly green light. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more frantic. They reached the car, but the engine wouldn't start. Chris banged his fist against the steering wheel. "Come on, come on." The figures appeared again, surrounding the car. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their mouths moving in silent chants. Emma screamed as the Harbinger emerged from the fountain, its form twisting and writhing as it stepped closer. The car finally roared to life, and Chris floored the gas pedal, plowing through the villagers as they screamed silently. The road twisted and turned, the rain blinding them. Every turn seemed to lead them back to the village, as if the roads themselves were alive. Finally, as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, the rain stopped. They found themselves on the main road, the village nowhere in sight. Weeks later, back in the city, Emma woke to the sound of rain tapping against her window. She sat up, her heart pounding. Outside, a shadow moved and a faint whisper reached her ears. "You'll never leave." The rain had followed them home. The rain never stopped in Ashmore Village. It wasn't a normal rain, the kind that cleansed the air or soothed you to sleep. No, this rain was different. It was cold and heavy, like it carried the weight of 1,000 drowned souls. It fell in endless sheets, masking the cries of the lost and silencing the screams of those who dared to venture into its cursed streets. On a night like this, 4 strangers found themselves trapped in the heart of Ashmore, where the rain never ended, and where no one escaped alive. The road stretched endlessly ahead, barely visible under the relentless downpour. Sophie tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. The wipers squealed as they struggled to keep up with the rain. Beside her, Dan scrolled through his phone, trying and failing to get a signal. "Nothing?" Sophie asked, her voice strained. "Not a single bar," Dan replied, shaking his head. "We're completely off the grid." In the back seat, Clara and Mike exchanged uneasy glances. "This storm wasn't in the forecast," Clara said. "We should have reached the cabin hours ago." "We're not stopping," Sophie said firmly, though the unease in her voice betrayed her confidence. "We'll find the cabin, or a motel, something." As if in response, the headlights caught a sign on the side of the road. Its lettering faded and warped by years of rain. "Ashmore Village, 2 miles." Dan frowned. "Ashmore? I've never heard of it." "Neither have I," Sophie said. But she slowed the car, squinting through the rain. "Let's check it out. Maybe someone there can help us." The road narrowed as they neared Ashmore, the forest pressing in on both sides. The rain seemed heavier here, a suffocating curtain that drowned out even the sound of the engine. Then, the village appeared. It was small, nestled in a valley surrounded by mist-covered hills. The houses were old, their wooden walls warped and moss-covered. Dim lanterns flickered weakly in the windows, their light barely piercing the gloom. The car rolled to a stop in the village square. In the center stood a statue, a woman with her hands outstretched, her face turned upward as if pleading with the sky. The rain had worn her features smooth, leaving her expression hauntingly blank. "This place is creepy," Clara said, shivering. Mike nodded. "Let's just find someone and get directions." They climbed out of the car, the rain instantly soaking them to the bone. The village was eerily silent, the only sound the relentless patter of water on stone. They spotted a faint light in one of the buildings, a weathered inn with a crooked sign that read, "The Dripping Dagger." Inside, the air was damp and cold. An old woman sat behind the counter, her eyes milky and unblinking. She looked up as they entered, her face void of emotion. "Travelers," she said, her voice low and cracked. "You shouldn't be here." "We got lost," Sophie explained, her teeth chattering. "We just need directions. Maybe somewhere to stay for the night." The old woman shook her head slowly. "There's no leaving Ashmore once the rain claims you." Dan frowned. "What does that mean?" She ignored his question, her gaze distant. Stay inside. Lock your doors. And whatever you do, don't answer if you hear knocking. Before they could press her further, she shuffled into the back room, leaving them alone in the dimly lit inn. This is insane, Clara whispered. We need to leave. We'll try again in the morning, Sophie said, though her voice was unsteady. Maybe the rain will let up. The rooms upstairs were small and sparsely furnished, but they offered a semblance of shelter from the storm. Sophie and Dan took one room, while Clara and Mike shared the other. Sophie sat by the window, staring out at the square. The statue loomed in the rain, its blank face haunting her. She could have sworn it had been facing the other direction when they arrived. Dan joined her, his brow furrowed. You're still thinking about what that woman said, aren't you? Of course I am, Sophie whispered. She seemed terrified. In the other room, Clara tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Mike sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. A soft knock broke the silence. Clara froze. Did you hear that? Mike nodded. Another knock came, louder this time. Who's there? He called, his voice shaking. No answer. Clara grabbed his arm. Don't open it. But the door rattled, as if something was trying to force its way in. Morning came, but the rain hadn't stopped. The village was eerily empty, the streets shrouded in mist. Determined to find answers, the group ventured to the church at the edge of town. Inside, they found an ancient altar, its surface carved with strange symbols. A leather-bound book lay open, its pages yellowed with age. Dan began to read aloud. In the time of famine, the villagers of Ashmore made a pact with the Lady of the Rain. She would bring them endless water for their crops, but the cost was steep. Every generation, a sacrifice must be made to appease her. Those who refuse are cursed to remain, their souls bound to the rain forever. Sophie's blood ran cold. She's real. The rain. It's her. Before they could process the revelation, a low, mournful wail echoed through the church. They turned to see shadowy figures emerging from the mist outside, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted with anguish. The villagers, Clara whispered. As night fell, the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but they grew louder, filling the air with a chilling chant. She is coming. She is coming. The group barricaded themselves in the inn, but it was no use. The shadows slipped through the cracks, their forms shifting and writhing like living water. Then, she appeared. The Lady of the Rain stepped into the square, her form towering and ethereal. Her face was pale and featureless, her body shimmering with liquid that dripped endlessly onto the cobblestones. Who will pay the price? Her voice echoed, deep and resonant. The shadows surged forward, forcing the group into the square. The lady's gaze fell on them, her presence suffocating. You trespassed, she said, her voice echoing like thunder. And now, you must choose. The group tried to run, but the rain seemed alive, dragging them back to the square. The lady reached out a hand, and Clara was lifted into the air, her screams drowned by the storm. No, Sophie cried, but it was too late. The rain consumed Clara, her body dissolving into mist. The lady turned to the others. Leave or share her fate. Terrified and grief-stricken, Sophie, Dan, and Mike fled. The road seemed endless, the rain blinding them at every turn, but finally, they broke free, the storm fading as they left Ashmore behind. Weeks later, Sophie woke to the sound of rain tapping against her window. She sat up, her heart racing. In the corner of a room stood a figure, its face blank and featureless, water dripping from its body. The whispers returned. You could never escape, and the rain began again. The rain came down in heavy sheets, relentless and cold. It was the kind of night where the world felt drowned in shadows, where nothing seemed alive except the sound of water pounding against the earth. Deep in the mist-shrouded hills, there was a village hidden by the storm, a place no map marked and no traveler returned from. When the rain began to flood their path, 4 weary souls took shelter in Graven Hollow. They thought they were escaping the storm, but in truth, they were walking straight into it. The car's headlights barely cut through the wall of rain, and the narrow, winding road seemed endless. "This can't be the right way," muttered Jason, gripping the wheel tightly. His knuckles were pale, his jaw clenched. Beside him, Emily was hunched over her phone, trying to make sense of their location. "There's no signal," she said, exasperated. "We haven't had bars for the last 20 minutes. In the back seat, Brian and Claire exchanged nervous glances. "I told you we shouldn't have taken the shortcut," Brian muttered. Claire sighed. "What's done is done. Let's just find a place to pull over. We can wait for the rain to pass." Jason slowed as a dim wooden sign appeared by the roadside, nearly obscured by the rain. "Graven Hollow, 1 mile. That's something," Jason said, his voice a mix of relief and hesitation. "Never heard of it," Emily replied, frowning. "Neither have I," Jason admitted, turning down the road anyway. "But it's better than sitting here waiting for the car to flood." The road led them through a dense forest, the trees towering overhead like sentinels. The rain seemed heavier here, almost alive, as if it were trying to push them back. When the village finally came into view, it was shrouded in mist. The buildings were old, their roofs sagging under the weight of years and water. Dim lights flickered in a few windows, but the streets were empty, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. They parked the car in the middle of the village square, next to a moss-covered fountain. In the dim light, they could see the fountain depicted a robed figure holding an urn, water spilling endlessly from its mouth. "Creepy," Claire whispered. Jason nodded toward a building with a faint light in the window. "There's an inn. Let's check it out." The inn sign swung in the wind, its faded letters spelling the Restful Haven. Inside, the air was damp and cold. A single oil lamp flickered on the counter, casting long shadows across the room. Behind the desk sat an old man, his face pale and deeply lined. "You shouldn't be here," he said, before they could speak. His voice was low, almost a growl. "We got caught in the storm," Jason explained. "We just need a place to stay for the night." The innkeeper stared at them for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "Rooms upstairs. But listen carefully. Stay inside once the sun sets. Lock your doors and windows. No matter what you hear, do not open them." Emily frowned. "Why? What happens at night?" The man's gaze hardened. "The rain isn't the only thing that comes alive after dark." The rooms were sparse but dry, a welcome relief from the relentless storm. Jason and Emily shared one room, while Brian and Claire took the one next door. The rain continued to pound against the windows, louder than it should have been. "I don't like this place," Emily said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Jason tried to reassure her. "It's just an old village. The guy downstairs is probably just superstitious." In the other room, Claire stared out the window. The fountain in the square seemed different, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Ryan, do you see that?" she whispered. He joined her, squinting through the rain. The statue's face, once indistinct, now seemed eerily human. Its eyes wide, its mouth open in a silent scream. Before either of them could say a word, a soft knock came at the door. "Who is it?" Brian called out. There was no answer, just the knock, louder this time. "Don't open it," Claire whispered, remembering the innkeeper's warning. The knock turned into pounding, the door rattling on its hinges. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning, the rain had not let up. The group decided to explore the village, hoping to find someone who could help them or give them directions. The streets were deserted, the windows of the houses dark. The only sound was the rain, hammering against the cobblestones. They found a small church at the edge of the village, its doors ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. At the altar sat an open book, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. Emily read aloud. In the year of famine, the villagers made a pact with the rainkeeper. She promised them salvation from drought, but her price was steep. Every 50 years, a soul must be given to the rain. If the offering is denied, the rain will claim all. Jason's voice was grim. We're 50 years too late. Before they could say more, a sound echoed through the church. A low, guttural moan that sent chills down their spines. They turned to see shadows moving in the doorway, humanoid forms made entirely of water. "Run!" Jason shouted. They fled back to the inn, barricading the doors and windows as the innkeeper had instructed. The shadows circled outside, their liquid bodies writhing and shifting. Then, a voice filled the air, deep and resonant. "You are not welcome here." The rainkeeper appeared in the square, her form towering and ethereal. Her face was featureless, but her presence was suffocating. "You trespass on cursed ground," she intoned. "One of you must pay the price." The group huddled together, terrified. "What do we do?" Claire whispered. "There's no way we're giving anyone up," Jason said. But the rainkeeper stepped closer, her watery form seeping through the cracks in the inn's walls. Shadows broke through the barricades, dragging Brian outside despite his screams. "No," Claire cried, but it was too late. The rainkeeper enveloped him in her liquid form, his body dissolving into the storm. The rain grew louder, almost deafening as the shadows retreated. The rainkeeper turned her gaze on the others. "Leave, and speak of this place to no one," she commanded. They didn't hesitate. Back on the road, the rain finally eased, but the memory of Graven Hollow lingered. Weeks later, as Jason lay in bed, a soft knock echoed from his window, and outside, the rain began again.